a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us for another session of Zeroe in Live. My name is Lauren Haworth, and I am the head of marketing at Zeroe. Now, the Zeroe in Live webinar series is about one thing, and that's clarity. We're here to cut through the noise and sustainability to bring transparency on how data, technology, and regulation are really reshaping this field. Each episode is designed to educate, to give you visibility into the shifts that matter, and to make sure that you walk away with practical insight, not just theory. So let's get into the agenda. This is going to be split into 3 sections. I'm going to do the first section, which basically covers what's wrong with sustainability and ESG reporting today. We're going to look at a couple of case studies and why it's been so easy to keep the narrative going without the data. Then I'm going to hand over to my wonderful colleague, Cecep, who's going to go through what verification actually requires. Cecep is a sustainability manager. He's been on the ground. He's done all of the reporting, and he knows what they're looking for. And then we've got a special treat for you guys today. We've got Farouk, who's our founder and CEO. He's going to be doing kind of a mini demo of the platform that's going to show you what a system is capable of today. So we're going to look at some technology. Right, let's jump right in. I always like to start off some segments with looking at some case studies that gives you a really good demonstration of what things are happening around the world in this space. Now, if we go back to 2015, some of you might remember what was called Dieselgate. And basically, it was the Volkswagen scandal that represents probably one of the most shocking examples of systemic deception in ESG reporting. Basically, what they did was a type of software manipulation. So VW installed devices that could detect emissions testing and lower emissions during those tests while allowing it to be 40 times higher during normal driving. Now, that scandal had affected millions of vehicles globally, and it actually led to one of the largest ESG-related penalties in history. And essentially what they've been doing is they've been marketing these vehicles as environmentally friendly while knowingly being deceptive with regulators and consumers. This case subsequently led to criminal charges. There were executive resignations, and there was massive reputational damage. And obviously, with a ticket like $34 billion in fines and settlements, that's a pretty scary number. This comes to a little bit more recent. In 2021, Toyota, up until that point, was also an enormous penalty that was imposed for violating the Environmental Protection Agency's emission reporting requirements. They were fined $180 million in 2021. Essentially, what they had done is they delayed the reporting of 78 emissions-related reports, and some of them were filed 8 years late. They also failed to share over 200 quarterly updates on emissions recalls between 2005 and 2015. Now, the delays led and allowed Toyota to continue to profit off the vehicle sales while they were concealing the emissions problems. And then obviously, subsequently in 2023, Toyota faced an additional scrutiny in Australia for also potentially overstating emissions reductions. So let's come to a newer one, which you might recognize. DWS. DWS is 81% owned by Deutsche Bank, and it basically manages around €1 trillion in assets. Essentially, what happened between 2020 and 2023, they were aggressively marketing their products as having strong ESG characteristics, claiming to be a leader in sustainability. Then in 2021, their head of sustainability at the time became a whistleblower, where she stepped forward to say the ESG integrations were overstated. So investigation started the German prosecutors and in the US. So by the time 2023 rolled around, the SEC fined DWS $25 million for misstatements about ESG investments and anti-money laundering violations. Now, just to be clear, out of the $25 million, 19 million was for the ESG investment misstatements, and the other 6 was for the AML. So that was a really large ticket. Then to add insult to injury, by 2045, in fact, April of this year, the German prosecutors concluded their investigation and imposed a further 25 million euro penalty. Now, catch this. They stated that the size of the fine was calculated based on the total revenue generated by DWS's parent company, Deutsche Bank. And that obviously made a lot of holding companies really nervous in understanding that all your subsidiaries, what they do and what they don't do, has major implications for the holding companies themselves. And I thought it was quite an interesting comment that was made by DWS in saying, in recent years, we have already publicly acknowledged that our marketing was sometimes exuberant. I think that's quite an understatement. Right, and moving on, the purpose of this particular slide is just to demonstrate the sheer scale. There were actually so many examples, I couldn't fit them onto one slide. But what I thought was really interesting was pre-2020, as you'll see at the top, there were a fair amount of landmark cases that were going on. A lot of it was more kind of scandals that were coming out. There were some large ticket items where there were fines and penalties. But what I noticed, and what you will as well, is in the last 5 years, though, there has been way more enforcement, and a lot of that has been financial. And we'll get into some of that now. I suppose also just leaning back into a former webinar that Baruch had mentioned, in 2024, 46% of the FTSE 100 companies publicly revised or restated their climate data. And the devil in that data was it was scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, those are not small adjustments. When companies issue sustainability reports with incomplete or inaccurate data, especially in the first year of disclosure, they risk way more than just regulatory penalties. We're talking about undermining internal trust and credibility with stakeholders. So there are large implications. Now, you might be saying, okay, so how did we even get here? Why was greenwashing and deception so easy to get away with? There are a couple of reasons. And to a certain degree, we are not entirely out of all of this. So let's just start off with the era of voluntary disclosure. To a certain degree, this still exists in a lot of places around the world, but there are some changes happening. So let's just look at what that was about. So ESG reporting was completely optional. Companies could choose if they wanted to report, what they wanted to report, and how they wanted to report. There were no universal standards, unlike GAAP or IFRS for financials. There was no mandatory assurance. So ESG reports were self-published, self-graded, and self-policed. And until very recently, no regulator had the authority, or perhaps even the will, to impose penalties for false claims. Then we look at some materiality manipulation. When there are no clear rules, companies can spotlight small green wins while ignoring their bigger impacts. Also, scope boundaries can be drawn to exclude messy and inconvenient data. And then baselines could also be gamed to make progress appear faster than what was in reality. Then we're going to move down to framework fragmentation. There were hundreds of competing frameworks with no global alignment. Don't get me wrong, there are still a lot of frameworks that are competing, but there is a little bit more alignment now. Additionally, companies could what was called framework shop. So essentially, they could pick whatever made them look best and what worked for their information. And there was also overlapping and inconsistent metrics, which created room for, again, cherry picking and selective reporting. Then we came to the situation where why regulators didn't act. Reality was ESG wasn't seen as financially material in the last 40 years. And jurisdictional fragmentation meant that global oversight was almost impossible. And then very lastly, there was a major technology gap. So data collection was, and mostly still is, manual. And you're dealing with a lot of spreadsheets. There's no systemic tracking, which means there can be major mistakes made and duplication of efforts. Anybody who's ever used Excel will understand you can skip a row, and by doing that, you can make a major mistake. And that is the reality with any kind of data collection. That has been the problem prior to, and that is a problem that a lot of companies are still dealing with at the moment. And we'll get into some of that detail as well. Second to that, supply chain and scope 3 data has been and still is to a certain degree very prohibitively difficult to gather. And then very lastly, we've got verification tools like blockchain traceability, satellite monitoring, AI classification either didn't exist or it wasn't able to scale. So I mean, the reality is ESG has not been a priority. There hasn't been major enforcement. There were no common standards. And companies basically just did the bare minimum to tick a box up until this point. So Now we sit in a position in 2025, what has changed? From a regulatory perspective, in the broader sense, changes have been sweeping and severe. We've got mandatory rules are here, CSRD, SEC climate rules, ISSB standards, etc. Governments have mandated lots of different changes, and that is going to have a waterfall effect. Second to that, penalties are real. We've seen in some of the case studies demonstrated before, fines in the millions or billions, executive bans, court-ordered business changes. The penalties and the sticks are quite severe. One of the other things that's changed, which is particularly important, especially for people who are just starting their journey in this space, in terms of verification. Limited assurance is what is prevalent now, but we are migrating towards reasonable assurance. And let me give you the differentiator. Limited assurance is a baseline verification. There's no rigor. The auditor concludes that there's no evidence of material misstatement, but they do not give a positive declaration of accuracy. This is generally a more cost-effective way of doing things, and is common for first-time or voluntary ESG reporting. However, we are moving to a space where there is reasonable assurance, and this is the highest practical level. It's akin to traditional financial audits. They've got in-depth verification, and a positive declaration from the auditor on accuracy is required. So quite significant changes happening in terms of the regulatory space. Then we also look at keeping on a broader level from a company perspective. Sustainability data is now driving real decision making. So you've got this data that is now determining procurement contracts, facility performance upgrades, capital investment planning, supplier evaluation and onboarding. Now, if the underlying data is wrong or it is unverifiable, the decisions and the consequences of those decisions can be long-term and incredibly costly. And I suppose we've got to lean into as well, we've got regulatory changes, we've got the stakes have changed, but some key challenges still remain. So research has shown us that about 60 to 80% of core ESG data is the same across different frameworks and standards. And you'll see the percentage of overlap demonstrated in this graph. TCFD and ISSB, and 95% of the data that they collect are the same. Now, up to 90% of that alignment is either climate or environmental data. And there's something really important to consider here. On one hand, we've got lots of different frameworks that are all requiring the same kind of data. On the other hand, the different framework and standard definitions, materiality, industry rules, and boundaries are all slightly different, which means teams are doing a lot of repetitive work. In other words, you get a situation where a team will do all the data gathering and present information in a structure, in a format that is required for framework X. Once that's done, then they need to go do the same process again for framework Y. And they land up, if you are a company that has to do a number of different disclosures, perhaps internal and external, the amount of repetitive work becomes exceptional. In fact, they've found that about 30 to 40% of data collection efforts are duplicated, which, if you're running the numbers for a company, is an enormous waste of resources, time, and cost. And then if we have a look at, it's not all doom and gloom, I promise. There is an opportunity in all of this. So regulations are changing pretty severely and pretty quickly as well, and there's obviously a waterfall effect in that process. Then you've got the case of companies are now relying on the data even more to make some really, really key decisions. But the problem is that a lot of the actual effort behind sustainability reporting and gathering of data, that has not changed as quickly. But there are some advancements that have come into the fore, which is key to obviously where Zeroe is sitting, the opportunities that technology has advanced to such a degree that there is a way to use one system to collect all the data required for all of the reports. And once that data is collected once, then you can output all those reports in whatever format you require.